and welcome to the Doomloop Dispatch, the show covering the worst parts of the San Francisco Bay Area. I'm Kevin L. Jones, and I'm here to ruin your day. Maybe. I'm not trying to, but be prepared. There's just too much stupid crap going on out there, and I do have to talk about it. Today, we're going to be returning to the San Francisco District 5 supervisor race because there's some really big updates. Not only did the Chronicle finally cover Bilal Mahmood's scrubbing of his claims of being a neuroscientist, Mahmood and his campaign responded on social media. Even some notable friends of Mahmood's are coming out of the woodwork to stick up for him. The whole thing is pretty much stupid and really weird. I also need to talk about techie tyrant Garry Tan. The New York Times recently profiled him, and I was just going to focus on that because it was written by former San Francisco Chronicle columnist Heather Knight, who I despise. But then journalist Gil Duran wrote a series of fantastic articles about Tan's connections to a growing fascist movement called the Network State. So later, we're going to discuss Tan, his buddies, and the psychotic movement and why all San Franciscans should want nothing to do with any of it. You'll just have to wait for my tirade about Knight. Before we get in the interview, though, we got to jump into some stories that you might have missed. I want to start with Eli Wolf's piece in the Oakland side about Oakland homeowners associations who are installing their own surveillance cameras and license plate readers. Basically, all the fancy neighborhoods like Lakeshore and Crestmont and Hillcrest estates are going full Karen. According to the story, neighborhoods started installing these surveillance systems on the recommendations of the Oakland police. The department did so, though, after being lobbied by the surveillance company Flock. According to The Intercept, Flock pushes police departments all over to basically sell their equipment for them to HOAs. Now, Flock cameras are in thousands of communities, including San Leandro, Piedmont, Berkeley, and Oakland. While their tech is spreading, there's good reason to believe it's not helping these communities. Flock would have you think otherwise, of course. It went as far as to publish a study back in February claiming that their devices helped solve 10% of crimes in communities that used it. It also bragged about how the Los Angeles suburb of San Marino saw crime decrease by 70% after installing Flock tech. But Forbes, with the help of some criminal justice experts, looked at the study and found it to be flawed. Why? Well, it depended on data from a few police departments, and a Flock rep acknowledged the data was inconsistent. The Forbes article even found Flock's claims about San Marino were false. After the city installed Flock cameras, burglaries, the most common crime in the town, went up, and all other crimes stayed flat. But Flock isn't a big problem because it's useless. Flock's technology poses a serious privacy issue, one so concerning that the ACLU made a call to action over it. The whole point of the technology is that it's creating easily accessible data from surveillance in real time, and not just pictures. It's license plate numbers, it's video, and it's all being fed into a central database being shared all over the nation. Police and sheriff departments in various parts of the country are already sending each other data. Here in the Bay, the Oakley Police Department is sharing its data with the New York Police for some reason. Clearly, the technology is just waiting to be abused. The Oakland side piece quotes an attorney from the Electronic Frontier Foundation who expressed concerns that the Flock database could be used to punish women who are crossing state lines to seek abortions. I also worry about domestic violence victims, many of whom need to hide because it's a matter of life or death. That's one of the first things you learn when you're reporting on something, anything that's happening in a classroom. You have to get permission to take pictures of kids because some of them could be hiding. Publishing their photos could endanger them. Then there's the fact that the most common abusers, those in law enforcement, can access the database. Domestic violence among LFOs is a serious issue that's getting worse. The Atlantic covered a study in 2019 that found that domestic violence was 2 to 4 times more common among families that had a member in law enforcement. So make sure you read that piece by Eli Wolf in Oakland Side. I'll post it in the comments below. And keep your eyes out for stories about Flock. Clearly, they are not your friends. Now, in news that makes me want to laugh and scream at the same time, San Francisco mayoral candidate Mark Farrell said he wants to bring the National Guard in to stop San Francisco's fentanyl crisis. In an interview he did with the San Francisco Examiner, he claimed that the streets of San Francisco had never been worse, which is just utter horse crap. If you don't know Farrell, he's a former interim mayor and he's one of these extreme law and order types. And for some reason, he thinks armed soldiers are going to make all the videos of people with the Fenty bins go away. How is this going to help? Who is this even for? I mean, even if Farrell wins the mayor's seat, he has no power over the National Guard. That's the governor. But really, bringing soldiers into urban areas does nothing but freak out regular people. Nobody likes seeing that unless they're psychotic. So, again, who is this for? Who wants to live in a city where you're surrounded by heavily armed soldiers and surveillance cameras? I think I know the answer, actually. It's power hungry techies like Garry Tan and Balaji Srinivasan. These millionaires, high on their own egos, think they can buy politicians and change government policy to benefit them. Sure, in that New York Times puff piece, what Tan says he wants might be all right for most people. You know, he wants beefed up police to battle crime. He wants better schools. He wants more housing. But there's a lot he's keeping out, like how far he really wants to go in his mission to control the government. And the reason I know Tan has deeper motivations is because both he and Srinivasan are major figures in the network state movement. The network state is basically a techie cult pushing for the takeover of cities like San Francisco so that they can extract as much wealth as they want. For this episode, I interviewed Gil Duran, a reporter who's been writing about the network state for the New York Republic in his Substack, The Parallel Mirror. Duran is a respected journalist who's also worked for major politicians like Dianne Feinstein and Jerry Brown. Being that he's been a part of a political machine makes you think that when he raises red flags about Tan Srinivasan and the network state, we should listen. So here's that interview. Alrighty, I'm speaking with Gil Duran. Or is it Duran?
Duran.
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 Like Duran. Oh, great. This is planet Earth. Anyways, but you are a longtime reporter as well as I would say a political maverick. You've helped local politicians, and it seems like now you're focused more on journalism, and you've been writing a lot of articles about the network state. So I wanted to definitely talk to you about that because especially after this Garry Tan profile came out in New York Times, you've been publishing a lot of great stuff. But first, I want to start with how did Garry Tan come into your radar as well as the network state?
Well, Garry Tan first came into my radar because I was just in the middle of moving to San Francisco. I hadn't fully moved here yet. And I remember I was eating at a restaurant and I was scrolling Twitter and someone was like, "Who is this guy?" And they were laughing because somebody named Garry Tan had blocked them on Twitter. And so then I tried to look up Garry Tan on Twitter. I'd never heard of Garry Tan. And I was blocked too. And I thought, well, that's weird. At the time, I didn't really know what that meant. I didn't realize he was using a blockchain, most likely. But I thought, I wonder if I said or did something. But it didn't really seem to matter because I didn't know who this person was, and they didn't seem very important to anything that I was doing. And so then going from being a person who was blocked by Garry Tan before I even moved to San Francisco, I was able to watch from the San Francisco Examiner and for the past year as a freelance writer, his evolution to this main character status in San Francisco politics as somebody pushing some pretty regressive policies, lightly disguised as moderate democratic policies. And, I started really paying close attention to him last summer when he threatened to wipe out the progressives on the Board of Supervisors. I thought, well, that's really hot language. Someone who spent a lot of time in politics, working for politicians, you sort of want to avoid getting too overheated, too negative like that, that kind of thing tends to turn off voters. And I couldn't think of a strategic reason why you'd want to have some little rich guy out there tweeting freelance. That tends to go against everything you do in politics, which is try to control the message and to try to give a very distinct impression of competent, sane, mature leadership. And instead, you got the guy spearheading this thing, just being a really toxic Twitter troll. And then we saw how that all ended when how it reached a crescendo back in January when he got drunk and tweeted what was perceived as a death threat at the progressives on the board of supervisors.
Yeah, and then when did this lead to the network state? You discovering the network state?
Well, I had been paying attention to him, and others on Twitter in San Francisco are very active, kind of showing what the connections are between these different people, like Garry Tan and Peter Thiel. Garry Tan started out as Palantir, which is run by Peter Thiel. You've got David Sachs, who's been playing a big role in all of this, and then who's another PayPal mafia, Elon Musk related character. And then in October, there was something called the Network State Conference. And at the Network State Conference, Garry Tan spoke, and he put his political project that he's spearheading in San Francisco very squarely in the context of it being a network state project, which involves the creation of parallel political institutions to replace and overpower existing political institutions, and parallel media institutions to rival and undermine existing media institutions and basically pump out the propaganda that Garry Tan and other tech, crypto bro, Peter Thiel, Elon Musk types want to be perceived as news. And then I got really interested in that because, again, with the political mistakes, you're just kind of going out there sort of like a mustache twirling villain and telling everybody what you're up to. You're laying out the whole plan. That's very strange behavior in politics. And the more I dug into the network state, I found that it's a very strange and extremist ideology. And unfortunately, it seems like these very wealthy tech billionaires are not just talking about it in podcasts and nerd conferences, they're using their money to try to make it happen. So I first got interested in California Forever, which is this city that the billionaires are trying to build or trying to force upon the people of Solano County, because what the network state ideology calls for is creating new cities and territories that are sovereign political units to some degree that will be ruled by tech billionaires as sort of company towns, where if you're a citizen, you're pretty much also an employee. And they see this as a way to escape democracy, which they view as unfriendly to their interests, and to also apparently corral their tax dollars away from the public infrastructure and public good and into projects of their own design and making. So I thought, why isn't anybody talking about this? And you have all these stories about the billionaires trying to build a weird city in Solano County, and no one has mentioned the phrase network state once. And there's literally an entire book that a guy named Balaji Srinivasan wrote called The Network State, How to Create a New Country. And it outlines the ideas for how to do this, why it's necessary. And Balaji Srinivasan is directly connected to multiple of the billionaires who are creating California Forever, the town of Solano County, and Garry Tan, who is trying to take over the city government of San Francisco, which, in addition to creating your own new city, as they're doing not only in Solano County, but in Honduras, and they're trying to do it in the Mediterranean. They're trying to create these projects all over the world. Srinivasan says you can also take over existing governments and institutions through elections. And that is very much the part of the project that I see Garry Tan pursuing. And by his own words at the Network State Conference here in San Francisco.
Yeah, and was it at the network state conference, where he said he wanted to turn San Francisco into Tokyo?
I'm not sure if that was. I think he used a Tokyo reference there, but they're constantly pointing to other cities and other countries that are better run or perceived as not having these problems. But they one thing about these tech types, they think they're reinventing everything, and they think they understand government and history better than anyone. But there's a lot of stuff they're missing, and a lot of stuff they don't want to see. They seem to think they can solve crime and addiction and poverty doing all the Republican right-wing stuff that never worked before. And there's no explanation you hear about why would this work differently now when it didn't work before. It's just this idea that because we are wealthy, because we are techies, we are going to create a future magically where none of this stuff exists. And I think what they really want to do is create a city that is hostile to people who are not wealthy techies and sort of kind of seize a portion of territory for themselves, not only here, but all over the world. And again, this is not me saying it. This is the network
Understand.
state ideology. It's written down. It's we can prove it exists. And but at the same time, nobody's talking about it.
And how did Balaji Srinivasan sell this in his book? Like, what is the main, like, the larger benefit to the world, or is he really just speaking to techies?
Well, they seem to have an idea that the future is going to be really bleak for most people, and that people with wealth and people with tech interests who have a tech based identity are going to need places to go, fortresses where they can sort of hide out and be in control and keep everyone else out. And this is apparently what they're going to do until, Elon gets them to Mars or whatever. They're very interested in this sort of idea of colonizing other places. And they seem to have abandoned the idea that, we've had in the past, that billionaires and millionaires want to contribute. We're going to solve poverty. We're going to solve these social issues. We're going to create a better, more perfect union. And we're going to overcome the circumstances of the social ills that are besetting our society. They don't seem very interested in that. They seem interested in creating a new society where none of these things exist and where they are in supreme control, sort of ignoring the fact that all wealth comes from society, from the infrastructure, from public infrastructure, from the labor of people who are not millionaires, etc. They seem to think they created all this out of nothing, and they need to go hoard it in a place where nobody can touch them. And that seems to be very appealing to some of these people. To some degree, too, it's sold as, imagine if you lived in a country that was based on your interest in yoga or other vegans or people who are into crypto. Like, what if you could have a country that's tailored to your interests? This is sort of the idea that's sold. But we have a word for that. Those are called cults. And they've been tried in a lot of places. In the 60s and 70s, you had ashrams. There's still ashrams around here where, like, the hippie types went to live. I know several people from the hippie days who lived on communes that seemed like a great idea at first, but eventually fall apart because personalities are a real bull to deal with, or people actually, after a few years, don't want to spend the rest of their life living communally with people who maybe they have less in common with now at the beginning. So they pretend like they're reinventing something new based around cultural interests. But when you look under it, what they're really after, I think, is escaping regulation, escaping law, and escaping taxation. And they've hit upon this idea that we can evade all of those things and not have the government take our wealth or redistribute our riches that are just towering above everyone else, and we're going to go and hide. And also, a lot of things they can do, they can maybe not have regulations like they have here. They seem to hate the SEC. Look what happened to Sam Bankman-Fried, now doing long time in prison. And so I think they want to be able to do as they wish without any laws, without any rules, and without any democracy.
Man, and it sounds like they just are ignoring the past. I mean, it sounds like, I mean, not all, you mentioned before company towns,
Mhm.
and it's like they never read about Pullman, where you literally had the residents eating dead bodies because there was no food because they totally just failed because Pullman himself, George Pullman, the owner of Pullman cars, train cars, didn't want to invest anymore. And it also sounds like when the libertarians try to start Galt's Gulch in South America, and that too fell apart. I
Mhm.
mean, it seems like, is there any basis in fact that they're reaching from to push these ideas?
I think a lot of what they do is based on not understanding history and not grasping things. I said a few times the political approach Garry Tan has taken by making himself the main character and saying all these crazy things all the time on Twitter. That's generally not how you want to approach these things. Mostly, if you're a gazillionaire donor who's trying to control things, you want to be in the background. You want to make it seem like it's a paranoid thing that people are saying that you control everything. You save those conversations for the back room at the fundraiser. You don't go on Twitter drunk and start ranting about these things. Nobody really has a lot of sympathy or allegiance to someone like that. Most of us are not wealthy people who are somehow still. Can you imagine having hundreds of millions of dollars and being on Twitter ranting all day? I mean, what is going on? Some people are suffering a great deal and they're not doing that in their lives. So I think a lot of it is based on not understanding some basic things, but having enough ego to think that you're so genius, you don't have to understand all that stuff. You can just reinvent it. And often when you look at when they try to reinvent stuff, they don't really reinvent it. They find a way to get a new revenue stream out of something that kind of already exists, or at least in the venture capital model, you get revenue for the gazillionaires based on an idea that doesn't really go anywhere once the venture capital runs out. It's not actually a workable model. Most of their businesses are not workable models, and I'd say the same is true of governance. So I don't know. I did see that someone started some kind of fund you can invest in network states, societies, and startup cities, and maybe that's the goal. There is to get a bunch of blue check crypto dorks to throw their money at this thing, and then take the money and run. I'm not really sure what it is, but I'd say that their cities and their societies are going to end up a lot like their companies do, which is to be based on a bunch of smoke and mirrors and not much else. Once there's not a free lunch on the table every day, so.
Yeah, and that's what's so surprising about this movement and how they feel so gung ho about it when the Financial Times just published a story about how VCs are actually losing funding, and we can even see that with Garry Tan's Y Combinator, the venture capital he works for, venture capital firm, because what they've invested in 5,000 companies. I want to say about 30 have actually paid off, and maybe
Mhm.
5 we know of, are like notable names. So it's like, where are they getting this? What's the word I'm looking for? This avarice. Where are they? Where are they get? Why do they think that this good stuff could work when they can't even keep their businesses going? Really?
Yeah, well, they're just trying to make big bets, right? And if a few big bets pay off, then they make their money, and they make their money along the way as well. But I'd say if you look at the businesses they do put out in the world, are most of them doing a lot of good for people? Is it improving workers' lives, or is it just sort of funneling money up to the top from everywhere else? So we're going into this period where the inequality is going to become so unsustainable that something's going to have to break and things are going to have to change. And they do so much ranting and raving about crime and addiction and the problems of poverty without ever seeming to really want to solve the poverty, right? They just want to lock people up and push people out. Most recently I uncovered, while doing some creative Googling, I wasn't even looking for this interview with Balaji Srinivasan on a podcast, a 4 hour long podcast, by the way. I always have a red flag if someone's talking for 4 hours straight. I couldn't talk for 4 hours straight about politics and government. I think it would be boring to people. But in this interview, he lays out what his vision would be for a San Francisco taken over by network state gazillionaires, who, oh, by the way, are actually trying to take over San Francisco right now. And he talks about the tech aligned people will wear gray t-shirts and they'll pay off the cops to serve them and be loyal to them, and they'll feed the cops to these big weekly banquets and give the cops' families all a bunch of jobs. There'll be sectors of the city where people who are blues, I'm assuming that means Democrats, progressives, will not be allowed to access the gray zones, and there'll be gray pride marches where all the grays and their gray uniformed police officers, because the grays are going to design the police officers' uniforms, apparently, will march in formation together, dressed in gray, with, quote, drones flying overhead in formation. I mean, I wasn't sure that I hadn't somehow been dosed with acid in my oatmeal and start tripping and making this stuff up. I asked somebody, "Can you listen to this and make sure that this is real?" Because what if I'm having some kind of episode here and I'm just imagining this? But they actually say this stuff, and so what they see is the need to use their wealth to escape from everyone else and to create a world in which they have total power. And you'll be, it's basically going back to medieval times. They'll be in a castle. The problems will be outside of the walls. And if they need to exploit your labor for some reason, they can do it cheaply. And you're not allowed inside. You literally, if you're not in their club, you cannot scan into their city.
Mm.
And their police will not help you because their police are feeding at the trough of the Greys. And their whole family, and the cops' whole families are feeding at the trough of the Greys. And he even says we'll pay Democratic police officers to leave and recruit them from other states like Texas, right? I mean, this sounds like I'm talking about some kind of crackpot theory that I heard on an AM radio show or the deep recesses of the internet. But this is a guy who wrote a book that was blurbed by Mark Andreessen. This is a guy who was a partner at Andreessen Horowitz and the CTO of Coinbase, and who put on a network state conference pushing these very ideas, where Garry Tan spoke glowingly of the concept of the network state and taking over San Francisco, which, according to Balaji Srinivasan, would be better off in a color-coded political authoritarian system ruled by tech billionaires. So,
intense.
Yeah, other than that, how's the weather?
And it's funny you mentioned the kind of medieval metaphors too. I'm also kind of reminded of the dragon as a metaphor. This insanely powerful beast sitting on its pile of gold, not wanting anyone to touch it or even getting near it, and that's like its only focus. I mean, that's what it seems like to me too. It's just all about their riches, expanding them and protecting them from taxation, regulation, anything else. And I mean, it's not like this is anything new. I mean, we've always had these kind of psychotic, selfish, rich people doing this. But it's so funny because tech is supposed to be so forward thinking, and these are really old ideas. And that's what always shocks me too about their hatred for progressives, because you would think what progressives want to do is really solve our problems and, not look at what's failed, but try to look into new things, look at the root causes of our problems. And I mean, Srinivasan wants to ethnically cleanse progressives. What is the hatred there? Do you know what the motivation is for that?
I think they are just realizing, and I think the pandemic radicalized a lot of them. Too much time alone, too much powerlessness, right? They couldn't compete with what was happening. They couldn't decide their own fates. We all had to be collectively unified against a common threat. I think they have come to understand that they cannot get their world the way they want it in a democracy. And they're not going to get it out of people who align with the values of the Democratic Party. You have to go to the right, because the right is the only place where wealthy people get to be superior, where wealthy males especially get to be superior, and where they can get taxes as lower or non-existent as possible, and where regulations are considered the enemy. So they have to align with the right, even though they don't believe in religion. They're not aligned with them religiously, and they're probably a little more liberal on some social issues. There's, Peter Thiel is gay, so they're not totally anti-LGBTQ, but they are very much against anybody who's not like them. It's largely a white movement, but not totally. But it is very male, and it's very much about the idea that if you are wealthy, you are better than other people. And that's a part of the conservative moral system. And so while they may not align with the Republican Party on everything, I think they've realized that the quickest path, the most optimal path to getting what we want, involves Republican governance. right? And if they were able to get enough power, they'd get rid of most of the religious parts of the Republicans. Anyway, they have no use for poor people in Appalachia or in the South. Um, but so I think that's the decision that's been made, and we've seen that with Elon Musk, who has sort of followed Trump in terms of becoming this wholly toxic character who very unnecessarily every day has to be out there stirring up the waters of disinformation and culture war, and he is the influencer. Other people are being like him now, and the idea that they're promoting is it's okay to be a racist, sexist, anti-trans, bigoted, loud, unabashed liar. Nobody can tell you not to. In fact, you can't say something is not true. You can't fact check something because that's censorship. But we could put a community note on your thing that's totally bullshit because we have the power, right? Blue checks are no longer journalists, experts, people who are known in their fields. Blue checks are now anybody who gives Elon $8 and they can be an anonymous person and they can just be a troll, right? He's reversed all of this. And in fact, Balaji Srinivasan, in his 4-hour rant about San Francisco, directly compares what he wants to do to San Francisco with what Elon has done to Twitter. Strip the blues of their status and replace them with something else that will have complete power, and not in a democracy. Not in a democracy. He talks about buying up city blocks and then creating private zones. Again, I don't think that works either. By the way, I don't think you can also have a system of patronage with the police department where you give them jobs and free food in exchange for them being loyal. That sounds like a federal crime to me, actually.
Yeah.
I wouldn't advise trying to pay off building inspectors. I mean, if you think that you got any corrupt scheme to buy off government that hasn't been tried in San Francisco, you haven't done your reading. So, again, they think they're reinventing things, but these things sound really, really bad to sane people. And but look, they've got a lot of money.
Yeah.
And I get the sense that a lot of people in politics and in the media are scared of them and don't want to challenge them. And so they're getting pretty far. And I think 2024 is going to be a real watershed year in terms of whether the network state and this rotten tech ideology of supremacy and control is going to move forward by taking over one of the most democratic blue cities in the world.
Yeah.
And that remains to be seen.
Yeah, and I'm reminded of that quote from Peter Thiel, who I kind of see as the godfather of this right-wing techie, and I want to say it's basically fascist. I mean, you're looking at fascism from their end, using the state to only benefit them and basically, creating an army of enforcers to get what they want. And Peter Thiel once said, democracy infringes on my rights, which I mean, it just says it all. It just says it totally maps out where these guys are coming from. But looking at this movement and their goals, what concerns you the most?
Well, obviously, what they want is nightmarish and is no longer democracy and is no longer America, really, if they get what they want. What concerns me the most right now is the complacency among Democrats, among, I think, many in the media, at a time when this nefarious ideology is rising up very loudly right in our midst. No one seems to be able to articulate what it is. No one seems interested in really challenging it. And I find that disturbing because that's how these things get farther than they should. No one will challenge them. No one will say it. And, I've got a lot of other things to do besides write about this stuff. I've got projects I'm working on that have nothing to do with it and that I'm, paid to do. So, my work on this is very much my own personal form of philanthropy. I feel like if someone else was covering it, I wouldn't feel the need to be up at front doing it. But until that happens, I feel like someone's got to raise the alarm and explain what is happening. So I'd say the thing that bothers me the most about it is that people don't really seem to realize what's going on yet, and that's a problem. And I think part of the problem in the media is that reporters even good political reporters don't really understand ideology or how it works or what it is or what the foundations of it are. And so there's this tendency to cover everything on a very superficial level as some kind of horse race, a competition between known concepts. There's left, there's right, there's moderate, whatever that means, kind of doesn't have a meaning. And I don't think this is a time where we can really do that. I think you got to dig deeper and look at what is really under this. And in the case of the network state and what Adrian LaFrance of The Atlantic calls the new tech authoritarianism, they've written a lot and they're saying a lot on podcasts and in conferences. It's not like I've got a hidden document that alleges this is happening. They are telling you, and there's that quote, was it from, I forget who it's from, when people tell you who they are, listen to them.
Yeah,
They're telling us who they are. And for some reason, not a lot of people are listening. And I think that'll change. I have faith that'll change. I'm not one of those people who's out there attacking the media. I write occasionally for the Chronicle. I know people are working really hard at different newspapers and trying to do this. But when you've got them trying to build a network state city in the middle of Solano County and no one has said the word network state, that's a huge failure of journalism. And I think part of what I'm trying to do is push the envelope and make them say it.
Yeah, I am absolutely with you on the failure of the media. And it's actually why I've walked away from working for local media. I used to work for KPIX, I used to freelance for the Chronicle. And especially after Heather Knight started publishing her hit pieces, I had to stop because it was so clearly biased and so not journalism. And the worst part is that when you would confront other reporters at the Chronicle, like I remember having arguments with Peter Hartlaub about Heather Knight's writing, and he's just like, well, it's an opinion piece. And for some reason, the media is using the cover of opinion pieces to push these puff profiles about these, network state workers, just like what Heather Knight did for the New York Times on Garry Tan. And I've been seeing it being used as such a powerful tool, especially in terms of like the YIMBY movement and stuff. There's a lot of stuff they push as fact, but it's still under like an opinion piece, and it still kind of reads like it's factual. But yeah, I noticed too that you started really writing these articles and pushing them after the Garry Tan profile came out on the New York Times. So yeah, you've already talked about the media kind of ignoring it, but do you see the media helping the network state?
I think by leaving out a big part of the story, it does help. Because if you make this look like a normal thing and all shucks, I'm a moderate guy just trying to get, moderate things done, and you leave out these alliances and allegiances, then it would be people aren't getting the full picture. And to be clear, I think it was last August, I started writing my piece about Garry Tan when he threatened to wipe out half the board of supervisors. I usually just start taking notes, trying to get out what is it I'm trying to say before I start actually writing something. And I wrote, if you don't know who Garry Tan is now, you will, because this is the guy trying to take over City Hall, and he's really aggressive on Twitter. And in my way of thinking, it's kind of like Chekhov's shotgun. It's going to go off at some point. I didn't think it'd be January, but my editors out there know that I was on this really early on before any of this stuff happened. I think people were like, well, why is this guy important? Why do we need because I think to some degree, I'd say that I think a lot of reporters are like, well, why should we pay attention to those assholes? Like, we're not going to give them any attention. I get that. But when someone's spending this much money to try to gain control of your government, you have to pay attention. You can't ignore it. And so, I wrote the piece after he did his Twitter death threats. I wrote a piece for the New Republic about him. I had already written a piece about California Forever being part of the network state movement, and I had mentioned Garry Tan in there. And so then I move on and I do a whole piece on Garry Tan and because people nationally started to take note. Who's this guy making all this noise and being really aggressive in San Francisco? And so my piece was out there like, I don't know, 2.5 months ago. I did think it was weird that the New York Times piece did not mention the network state at all and completely made it very one-dimensional. Because if you look at Balaji, of course, this is the main brain behind the philosophy that Garry Tan is pushing to take over a city and be part of the network state. I read Balaji's book, and he goes on and on and on for pages about how evil he thinks the New York Times is. He thinks that the New York Times is the number one tool of the progressive left, which would be news to the progressive left, which is also attacking the New York Times.
Yeah.
I'm not a big New York Times attacker. I don't expect everything I want from a news story. It kind of grows over time often, and I get the job of reporter. I'm an opinion reporter, so I can go beyond what they can say, and I get what their constraints are. But he especially hates the Sulzberger family. And so I felt like, since the New York Times had this piece rehabbing Gary's image and not telling the full scale of his political alliances and foundations, that it'd be a good time to kind of point out to people in good faith, because I'm not going on the attack against other journalists. I'm very much just adding more open source information to the conversation, that the New York Times is considered the enemy by these people. And by the way, within like a day or two of the New York Times piece coming out, and Gary's posting it and celebrating it, he starts going on the attack against the San Francisco Chronicle, saying that it's a lying newspaper, his allies saying that it no longer reports news because they did a story about a local candidate, Bilal Mahmood, who got caught fudging his resume.
Yep.
And so it's almost as if, because after he did the death threat thing, he had this silent period where he's only tweeting about business stuff, very light, maybe retweeting some political stuff. And now he got what he wanted. He got a nice glowing profile in the New York Times, and now he can go on the attack again.
Mm-hmm.
Right? Maybe don't get drunk and make death threats, but to call the San Francisco to say that the San Francisco Chronicle is dishonest and lying.
A smear. It was a smear.
Yeah, when you just got written up glowingly by a former Chronicle columnist in the New York Times, it's quite perverse to do that. He almost kind of burned Heather by completely taking the mask off and going back at it as soon as he got what he wanted out of the New York Times, which, by the way, New York Times, the network state, hates you and thinks that the New York Times must be overthrown for the network state to get what it wants, to rise to its level of supremacy in our political system. And so I wrote that up, and I got a lot of friends at the New York Times, and I sent it to them too, because they should be aware of it. You may not be aware of the network state, New York Times, but the network state is highly aware of you, and they're coming. And you see that with Elon Musk attacking the New York Times. There's this really big desire, a necessity of this movement to undermine the legitimacy of the mainstream media and replace it with what they call parallel institutions, which are institutions that will be propaganda organs disguised as news. We're going to see this kind of come to a head here very soon. And basically, it's what the right wing has done, right? The Republicans have done that with Fox, with these other channels they have that just spew this stuff. But they need their own version that tells the kind of tech billionaire crypto reality. And Garry Tan specifically says Elon Musk's Twitter was a big victory for this movement to create a parallel society and media. And so if you're a moderate Democrat, like Tan claims to be, why would Elon Musk's Twitter be a victory for you?
Yep.
It's not, those things don't match. But these things were not really examined in that piece. And again, but give it time. Give it time. What I said in the piece that I wrote was that stories that don't talk about the network state but do talk about all these characters are not going to age very well. You left out an important piece of the story. But as I said, I know how this works. Sometimes it has to develop over a period of time. And I'd say in 3 to 5 years, there'll be a lot of stories about the network state. They're already popping up in different parts of the world. They're building in Africa. They're taking over stuff. They're building these cities. They're suing the government of Honduras for $11 billion because the government is stopping them from building a city called Prospera, which they want to build. So this is not something that's going to stay in the shadows forever. And so in a way, the media, please take your time getting around to this, because I have a few more pieces I want to write. And when it's a big deal, I'm going to be able to say, yeah, see, first,
And really, that's all what every journalist wants to be able to get, that scoop, right?
I, I I guess, there've been times when I don't write something that's in my mind, and then later it happens. I'm like, damn it, I should have written that.
Yeah,
And
yeah.
I'm not losing time on this one. Fortunately, I'm what you call a time billionaire. I'm a freelancer, so I have the time.
Yeah, you do.
You know.
I know, but it cracks me up because, yeah, I mean, the New York Times is no longer Arthur Gelb's New York Times.
Mhm.
It's a much different beast. That's why, they focus on columns from Ross Douthat and, pieces. But I mean, Barry Weiss was employed by the New York Times for a long while. So it's really funny that they still see it as this enemy. But I guess in that case, because they still have the responsibility to report the truth. And that's what offended me so much about their attacks on Aldo and the Chronicle for the piece about Bilal Mahmood. I mean, what they reported was already out there, was backed by evidence. It's all there. And really, if you read that story, it's just the facts. It's just, there is no narrative there. It is just a straight telling of what's going on. And they made it sound, again, like a hit piece, like a smear. Even though, and it just goes to show that they want to set up another reality, hence why, what, Michael Moritz is the one that started SF Standard.
Mhm.
You also have what, the Marina Times and all these kind of
The forthcoming
companies.
voice of San Francisco
Yeah,
coming.
yeah, and it's so funny because it's like it already seemed like they've captured these other things, but they got to have more.
Well, yeah. Well, I think one thing is that these institutions like the Chronicle, they do have tremendous power still. The Chronicle's been a mainstay of San Francisco since 1865. You think you're going to come in with some blog and just undo that? You know?
Yeah.
And I think the Standard has some great reporters doing some great reporting, right? They haven't hired in this iteration a bunch of right wingers to come in and do what the voice of San Francisco is very shortly going to be doing.
Hmm.
Uh, but uh, I don't think that it's making a profit, right? And
Hmm.
if you were not just being funded by a billionaire, you wouldn't be anywhere. So, and those things, in my experience, tend not to last very long, right? I went to the Examiner because there was going to be a lot of money behind it, a lot of investment. Well, the appetite for investment in journalism tends to shrink up pretty quickly, unless you have some other motive that makes it worthwhile. LA Times, owned by a billionaire, just cut hundreds of jobs, right?
Yep.
So it's really hard to be in this business and make money at it. And so there's that. Who would be going into the media business right now without some other motive about power and control? And so I think the Chronicle has its established place. And they don't like that, just like the New York Times has its established place. And what was interesting about the Mahmood story is that they acted like this had never been done before. And I wrote a piece about this too. They acted like, how dare you? This was planted, they allege, by Dean Preston's campaign, and how dare you say he's not a neuroscientist? Well, having spent a lot of my career in politics, everybody knows that a resume puffing story is a get. You're
Hmm.
gonna get that somewhere. That's a narrative we know. People do it a lot. And also campaigns planting Oppo. I'm not sure if Preston's campaign did or did not plant that. It's quite plausible they did. That's how the game is played.
Yeah.
There's a thing called an Oppo researcher. Their job is to find stuff to plant during the campaign that will complicate your opponent's narrative. And so again, does anybody here know how this game is played? Because they're screeching like babies about stuff that is just old hat. And if you notice today, there's a story in Cal Matters by Alexei Kosev. Gavin Newsom got caught. He's been talking about how he played baseball at Santa Clara for years, and it turns out he didn't. He didn't make the roster. He was affiliated in some way, but was the story was exaggerated, embellished, puffed. So even if you're the governor of California and they catch you doing something like that, they're going to get you.
Hmm.
And but they made it seem like the Chronicle had committed some grave crime. And when it's actually they did something very normal that happens in every single campaign. When Jerry Brown, I worked for Jerry Brown when he was running for Attorney General, Mayor of Oakland, the Republicans went and filed an investigation demanding that the bar determine that he wasn't eligible to run for AG because his bar card hadn't been re-upped for a full 5 years. Because you got to, if you're not practicing law, you tend to let your license go dormant. And then if you're going to run for AG, you got to like get your license back on. Now, what the law means is that you had to run for AG, you've had to have been admitted to the bar for a total of 5 years before you can run. They try to interpret it as, since he hadn't been his license hadn't been active for the previous 5 years, that meant he couldn't run. Of course, that went nowhere. It was stupid. It died, but they got media coverage out of it.
Yep.
Right? It was like, oh wow, is Jerry allowed to run? The media went with that. It was annoying, but that's the kind of thing that's going to happen. And if you shit the bed and you fall down and scream and roll around because something very normal happened, you're really not fit for politics. And they aren't. I think Bilal Mahmood is in serious trouble. I think he's a terrible candidate. And I mean, he also endorsed Barbara Lee. I mean, I think they're learning that District 5 is pretty damn progressive. But you can't be progressive without pissing off all the little blue checks, and you just
Yep.
And now they got you on neuroscientist. He's just sort of slipping on his own mess.
Yeah, and I'm interested to see too if anyone starts looking into his nonprofits and seeing how
there seems to be more there.
Yeah,
and there's an old Latin saying, I think, false in one, false in all.
Yeah.
So he had better figure out that narrative. But what they're trying to do, it doesn't make sense to overreact in this way to a very basic story, very basic political story. So I think it's just part of their strategy to undermine the credibility and legitimacy of the Chronicle. And I think they're going to continue to try to do that in any way they can while trying to push people toward their own media organs, where they're going to get the real news, which is the news as the tech billionaires want you to read it and understand it. And I don't know that that'll work, but they're certainly going to try.
Or also too, it seems to also have the effect of where the Chronicle insist on more favorable coverage as well.
Yeah, working the refs. How dare you do that? But I think there are some editors, editors at newspapers, especially ones that have been there a long time. They played all these damn games. You have people go to your editor, unless you really screwed up, unless you messed up the facts, unless you're caught getting assigned a story by a politician or something, your editors are going to have your back. You got to do the reporting. And I think that the only thing you do when you behave like this is show everybody, even the people who might have given you the benefit of the doubt, that you are completely irrational and that you are not having a good faith discussion. Because I've worked stories when I was a press secretary to somebody. You call the person and you talk. Now everybody just goes on Twitter and attacks, and that may feel good, and that may convince people who are like you that that's what's going on. But if you're in a professional capacity, you really want to. It's more powerful to have those conversations privately if you have a legitimate grievance. Because if you try to lean on a real journalist just to be on your side because you have money or whatever, they're going to tell you where to stick it. Hopefully.
Yep.
So.
And that always feels good. I've definitely been on both sides of it where, the politician calls up, we don't like this word, change this word. It's like, oh, fine, who cares?
All of that stuff. You got to have a legitimate, in fact, as a political press secretary, a lot of the job is talking politicians out of that kind of stuff when there's not something. Now, occasionally there is some legit thing you got to go litigate. Be like, this is inaccurate. This is why it's inaccurate. We can prove it's inaccurate. And, but then you call for a correction or a retraction.
Yep.
Have they called for a retraction? I don't think so.
Yep.
You can always tell when somebody throws a big public fit, but they're not calling for a retraction, which would trigger I don't know, maybe they have, but that triggers a formal process, as you know, but then you might not get the answer you want because you'll get a repetition of the fact that it's true.
Yep. Exactly. And yeah, that made me so angry when Garry Tan actually called out Aldo by name. I mean, it wasn't the newspaper, it was this reporter, and that's terrible because, reporters are subjected to violence sometimes, Chauncey Bailey. I mean, that's all I have to say. And when, supervisors are getting threats because of what Garry Tan has said, I mean, that's a real issue. But
yeah, and it's also a badge of honor, right?
yeah,
You did something good when they're attacking you in this way, and you should do more of whatever you did that was so good and so necessary and so journalistic that they had to attack you by name.
exactly. So, looking at this whole big picture, it still seems that this movement still needs special elections to get the political wins they need. I mean, they have to look to low turnout special elections to really see successes. Um, do you think it's picking up momentum and will win more? Or do you think now that they're in the sunlight, the disinfectant's coming and they're going to be losing power?
I think it remains to be seen. I think it'll go on for quite some time. I don't think it'll all be decided in one election. I do think the map is a little complicated for them on the Board of Supervisors elections because, to me, the big question is, can you beat Preston?
Mhm.
Right? That'll be, to me, the real litmus test because
The
they're putting a
dude with
lot of
Bernie Sanders endorsement,
yeah, and like,
what
oh, hey,
supervisor has that?
what an easy target. The only Democratic socialist on the Board of Supervisors. If you can't take him out, well, then how powerful are you really? And I think it's going to be complicated because I mean, I lived District 5 was where I lived when I was the examiner, and and now he's got the tenderloin. He's a guy who spent his career advocating for renters. And by the way, I've had plenty of differences with Dean Preston and have criticized him as a journalist. But the way they vilified him and made him the new Chesa Boudin responsible for all the city's problems is completely disingenuous and false. And I take exception to anybody who engages in that kind of dishonest behavior. But I think that's a question. I don't know if they can win the mission. I don't know if they can win Peskin's district. And you look at it, even if they get their preferred candidate to win the mayor, London Breed, what do you gain by getting the voters to reelect somebody who 71% of the voters think has done a bad job?
Exactly.
Right? How do you not end up responsible for everything that's wrong in the city in 4 years?
Mhm.
It's really a conundrum to me. It would seem like they would need to line up behind Farrell or Lurie, as opposed to trying to convince the voters that someone who has a 71% disapproval rating deserves another chance.
Mhm.
That to me is one of the more bizarre formulations I've seen in local politics. So we'll see. I think it could be a mixed verdict. I think Breed could get reelected, but then I don't think that's a win. I think that'll be a problem because okay, you guys claim you're so smart with all your money and your technology, and this is what you did. You got an unpopular mayor who's proven she's not up to the task reelected. That's very unusual.
Yeah.
And so I think it'll be a mixed bag. I don't know we'll have a complete verdict, but I think we'll have a partial one. And the bigger thing beyond political affiliations is that people are really suffering. I think what the tech people are not wrong about, what they've realized is that there are some really exploitable political issues here that haven't been solved. We do have a massive homelessness problem, a massive overdose problem, and the people in charge of the city, who are all Democrats, haven't solved it, haven't even made a big dent in it. It's gotten worse. But I don't think they have a plan, these billionaires, to solve those problems. They only want to exploit those issues by pretending to care for them on a superficial level in order to capture power and serve themselves. And so I do think that it's sad that there's not a more rational group who wants to find a way to make things more collaborative, and actually solve these problems. The one thing I really don't get is their hatred of harm reduction and overdose prevention, because anyone who looks at the evidence and the research knows that has to be a part of it. I don't want to see people flopping over and suffering on the streets either. I'm not someone who thinks, hey, let everyone do what they want. And if locking them up would solve the problem, it'd be harder to argue about against it. But we already know that that's not what's going to solve the problem. And we know what countries that did solve the problem have done, which is embrace a mix of both traditional rehab, but also grades and different modes to bring everybody in. The
Hmm.
first thing you got to do is keep people from dying,
Yeah.
you know, and but they don't. They want to pursue this really strict, failed model, and this does not strike me as people who are in any way enlightened or knowledgeable or acting in good faith. And if we could even find a way to have a middle ground on that, right? I personally, they seem to think I'm a far left progressive. That was the opposite of my reputation in Sacramento, where I often butted heads with the DSA. Um, and then here, I became this. They think I'm on the left because I don't think a bunch of tech billionaires with their propaganda machine should be able to take over a city and impose a bunch of right wing policies. But I'd say I'm actually kind of more of an actual moderate, you know?
Yeah.
If you wanna have a city where no one's allowed to do drugs on the street or they get arrested, then give people a place to go
Yep.
where they can be safe, where they can be protected, where they can have overdoses prevented and maybe live to get into rehab, and then have resources there the moment someone has a moment of clarity to be able to get into treatment. And I started off myself as an enemy of harm reduction. I grew up around drugs. People in my family were on drugs. I thought it was the craziest thing I'd ever heard of, that you would allow drugs, that you would not try to immediately force someone off of them. And it took a lot of time and a lot of personal experience and suffering to see how wrong I had been in those early days.
Yeah.
And I came around to it. So I'm not like, oh, yes, everyone should do drugs. I started off just like everybody else. Obviously, you got to put them in jail. I had a relative who went to jail for drugs, and I thought, good, now they'll get clean. Guess what? That's
Nope.
not how it works. That's not how it works.
No, and it's so weird because especially after the closure of the Tenderloin Center, which data showed decreased overdoses and did help the area.
Mhm.
I mean, but what, they closed it after just a few months, if
Was it
that?
like 9 months? Yeah.
Yeah.
And you
Yeah.
had immediately had these funded activist groups trying to shut it down. And the strategy there was don't give it a chance to succeed.
Hmm.
Start screaming immediately. Immediately. You remember the Mothers Against Drug Deaths group that sprang up, a bunch of mothers from not San Francisco coming in? A lot of their kids actually OD'd on pills they got on the mail in other counties.
Yep.
How'd that have anything to do with the Tenderloin? And it
Doesn't
turns
matter.
out that some of these people were being paid out of Michael Schellenberger's nonprofit after being covered in the
Tumult.
newspapers as just activists who cared.
Yeah.
And so everybody got rolled with that one. And yeah, it's made it impossible to pursue rational policy solutions that could save lives. And so that's why I don't have any respect for these people, is because there are a few issues where anybody who's educated and rational knows that the policy we had to pursue there is not the one they're recommending. You know, there are things we can argue about. Yeah, housing, I'm probably the opposite of a lot of people on the left. I think we need more housing. I wouldn't identify myself
As a
by an
YIMBY.
acronym that, you know, but I so I'm not fully aligned with everyone on the left, but I think, you know, I don't see these people as being in any way moderate. They don't want a middle ground. They want it all the way to the right, and well, seeming like the left. That's part of the game they're playing now, is can we make Democratic voters in San Francisco think that Republican policies are Democratic policies?
Oh,
And
it's hard not to think there's like mass pinkwashing going on with as many right-wing gay politicians you have, like Matt Dorsey or Trevor Chandler, who's running for District 9 supervisor, who, you know, is like, you know, full front, you know, I have a boyfriend, but at that same time, you know, is not left at all. The dude used to work for IPAC. But yeah, with the Tenderloin Center too, it's so, I still look back at it and wonder, was it about curb appeal because of how much was invested in San Francisco and San Francisco real estate? I mean, you have over a billion invested in Transamerica alone. Or was it just about needing that issue for political goals? You know, we actually do need these people experiencing the Fenty bends on the street because it helps our case, you know, and that's how sick and twisted it feels like in San Francisco politics right
uh,
now.
well, even worse, there's a group funding anti-harm reduction campaigns up and down the West Coast, right? And I think there are people who they don't care if the evidence and data show it's effective. They have a moral issue with it.
Mm-hmm.
They believe that uh, addiction is a personal failure and that it must be corrected with strict, harsh punishment. And it cannot be in any way tolerated, even to save the life of the person. And there's kind of a mix here. It's not all one thing or the other. There's a mix of characters involved, and that's something I'm going to dig into. I can't say much about it now. I'm going to be digging into that a little bit, but it is really tragic to me. There are lives on the line. This is not just a game of our team wins, your team wins. There are people really suffering, and it seems like with all the brain power and capital in San Francisco, there ought to be a way to have a common argument about how do we do the most good and do the least harm. And instead, it's all or nothing and regressive policies that didn't work before. Because believe me, San Francisco's tried. I wrote at the Examiner. I wrote a whole piece looking back at 50 years of Tenderloin crackdowns, and it's
Mm-hmm.
always been worse than it's ever been. And they put hundreds of cops there. They built a new police station there back in the 80s, and people do drugs with inside of it. So, well, bring in the National Guard. Go ahead. People will do drugs right in front of the National
Yes,
Guard,
exactly.
right? So, uh, I think that we have a very polarized situation, and the people pretending to be rational and moderate are anything but.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. I would almost say they're almost like spoiled brats of, I want it though. This is what I want. But that's me. I want to say thank you so much, Gil, for this. This was great talking with you. But I do have one last question for you that's kind of off topic.
Mhm.
You used to work for Dianne Feinstein.
Mhm.
Now, what is your viewpoint on her final years? Especially, it sounded like she was gone for a long while before she actually passed away, and yet was
Mhm.
still being propped up. Did you see that at all? And what, looking back on her legacy, what are some of your thoughts?
I hadn't been in touch with her for a very long time. I had gone actually to there was about a year and a half before she died. There was a reunion of the staff in DC, and I went to that. But it was full of people, and I didn't get a chance to talk to her. But as far as understood, she knew who everybody was, remembered everybody's names, remembered the names of their kids. So it didn't seem like, I think my understanding with the situation was that there were some days that were better than others. I do think it was a mistake probably for her to run again, but the voters chose her over a much younger candidate. They kept doing it. And
Mm-hmm.
I think I wrote a piece about this when she died. I wrote a piece in the Chronicle, and um, it was a double-edged sword. Her inability to quit, her tenacity is what made her rise up in politics despite a lot of challenges, like women not supposed to be in charge, like an assassination, losing the mayor's race. And in the end, she couldn't turn it off. She had to keep going. And so I think it's, she was probably one of the hardest bosses I ever had to work for ideologically. We disagreed on a lot of things, and I think what people don't realize about the staff is the degree to which they did a lot of work to pull her away from positions that would have been, that part of what your job is to argue with the boss, is to debate, is to pull them back from things. And a lot of people did a lot of work to make sure that she had a rounded view of a lot of different things. But I used to call her the most popular Republican in California because it'd be very, very vexing. And I have a lot of good memories of her. She was definitely a taskmaster. I've never seen anybody work as hard from the moment she wakes up till the moment she went to sleep. And even on Saturdays and Sundays, she was always, always working. She took it very, very, very seriously. And not every politician does that, believe me. So I think it's tragic what happened. It's a lesson for knowing when to step away. And at the same time, the people of California kept sending her back. And so, as long as she felt, she probably didn't envision that it would become so hard so quickly. She probably thought, and Heck, if she could have run for another term at 90, she would have. But obviously, that will not come to pass. So.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. And she did do some good, you know. I was, you know, the assault rifle ban did work, you know,
Hmm.
and that is something you should hang your hat on, you know?
Yeah, and when I was there, I think one of the things that was most meaningful to me was she opened the investigation into the CIA torture regime.
Oh,
That
yeah.
was her, right? There's a movie about it with Annette Bening, and that took some bravery and kind of was interesting to me that she really had a moral compulsion to take on the intelligence agencies and to expose what they had done. And there were a lot of things she did where we'd be like, no, or
Yeah.
but I always reminded myself in moments of great disagreement that she's the one they voted for, right?
Mhm.
And she put me here. And this was early in my career where I was kind of shocked to find myself in politics. And hey, you get an invitation to go to Washington and work for a senator. Sounds like a thing to do, you know?
Yeah.
And so I that was part of that whole journey. And I learned a lot, but I did my time. We hadn't really talked. Politicians get very mad when you leave them for other politicians. And so when I left to work for Jerry Brown, uh, that was, let's just say, most staffers get a nice watercolor painting that she did when they leave, and there was no
Uh-huh.
watercolor or Christmas cards for me after that. So,
Well, politics are still very personal.
yeah, that's a crime you don't commit, leaving for another politician.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much, Gil. I really appreciate you taking the time to speak with me. I'm going to list all your articles below in the comments. I suggest everybody read them. They're all great and they're maybe a little scary. You might have some nightmares after reading them, but then it just shows to show we need to keep fighting. So thanks again, Gil.
Hey, thanks for having me. Good luck.
Thanks, man. Now, before I wrap up, I have to talk about the Bilal Mahmood scandal. Finally, publications other than SF has reported on it, including the San Francisco Chronicle. And Mahmood finally responded. Was his statement contrite? No, not really. He basically maintains that he didn't lie because he worked in a neuroscience lab when he was an undergrad at Stanford. He even had as supervisor from that job, famed neuroscience professor Robert Sapolsky, write a letter supporting his assertion. You could read all of Mahmood's excuses in a long thread he posted on Twitter, or you could read in a similar thread written by his buddy Sharky Laguana. Funny name, huh? You might have heard it before if you followed alternative music back in the late 90s or in early aughts, as Laguana was the indie rock band Creeper Lagoon. They went pretty far. They signed to DreamWorks, and Spin called them the band to watch in 98. But now he's a rental van mogul. After the band stopped, Laguana started a van rental business, and over the years, it's expanded to several cities across the US. He's even become the president of the American Car Rental Association. Laguana is also entrenched in San Francisco's current government, having been appointed to be the president of San Francisco's Small Business Commission by Mayor Breed herself. With the Twitter thread he posted, which I repeat is very similar to Mahmood's, Laguana made it clear what side he's on. He tried to play it cooler than Mahmood by saying he doesn't hate Mahmood's main opponent, Dean Preston, but he went after the neuroscientists who wrote the letter calling out Mahmood, even trying to conjure a conspiracy theory by showing that one of them celebrated the unionization of Anchor Brewery along with Preston. Funny, in the picture he posted, he didn't show the larger picture, which showed a ton of people celebrating Anchor Brewery's unionization. Laguana really debased himself too, defending Mahmood's actions in a second thread by saying it was a cultural issue. Worst of all, he went after the Chronicle for publishing the story, calling the piece a smear. And his attack inspired techie tyrant Garry Tan to jump in and unpile on one of the journalists who wrote it. Remember, Tan inspired folks to send death threats to supervisors he called out. That poor journalist probably had a terrible weekend worrying he was going to lose his job. Thankfully, everyone is seeing through Mahmood's line of BS. Joe Eskenazi wrote a great piece for Mission Local pointing out how ludicrous Mahmood's defense was, and he even quoted the Bay Area's king PR mercenary, Sam Singer, agreeing with him. While Mahmood's efforts to defend himself seem to have fallen flat, I want to address Laquana. Hey, Sharky, Kevin here. Remember back in the 90s when we used to talk about selling out? Remember Maximum Rock and Roll and all that, calling out bands that signed to major labels? Well, we can all admit now that was kind of ridiculous. I mean, what's wrong with trying to live off your art and make sure everyone around the world can access it? But what you're doing right now is a much worse version of selling out. You might not see yourself as selling out because you've embraced capitalism. But let me be clear. You're selling out the artist community that welcomed you here when you came here in the 90s. Almost all the artists that made San Francisco the creative hub that it was back then are gone now because of people like Tan and Mahmood. The techie influence caused the cost of living in SF to skyrocket, sending the creative class to more affordable areas. It also inspired real estate and speculators to buy up property and evict anyone who couldn't afford top of the market rent, hence our homeless crisis. Defending Mahmood is bad enough, but before this, you also came to defense of another supervisor candidate, Trevor Chandler. An ethics complaint was filed against Chandler, a District 9 supervisor, because he said he was a full time teacher when he was actually a substitute who had signed up for the job the day before he filed his campaign paperwork. You called this complaint and the news around it a smear. It was true. There's plenty of evidence. Even worse, before Chandler was a teacher, he worked for years as an AIPAC lobbyist, the group directly responsible for the US providing bombs to Israel. Israel used those bombs to kill thousands of innocent Palestinians over the past 6 months. And Chandler has yet to admit any remorse for working at such a heinous organization. So, Sharky, as these campaigns go on, I suggest thinking about your legacy. You might think people will remember you just as the rock musician turned rental car mogul. Maybe you'll even be noted as the man who lobbied the feds to install charging stations for electric vehicles all over the US, like a Johnny Appleseed for EVs. But what you're doing right now is leaving serious stains on your rep. These are deep, dark stains that won't ever come out, especially today with the internet at everyone's fingertips. I just want you to remember that the next time you volunteer to cover for a lying politician or a lobbyist for a genocidal country. Now, for everyone else out there, thank you for joining me. Please like and subscribe on YouTube or leave me a review on Apple and Spotify podcasts. I'm on Twitter and Instagram, both Doomloop Dispatch, though I just set up that Instagram account and I might not have anything up there. Really, I have little time to do this. So even my social media gets ignored, except for the constant trolling I do. I hope to see you next week. And until then, keep fighting the good fight.